You are listening to a short excerpt of Shipwrecked in the Land of King Tobacco, the first Washington family immigrant to America, read by the author, Nicholas-D-Garrett. George Washington's great-grandfather John arrived in the Virginia colony by ship to trade goods for tobacco. He ended up staying when a shipwreck soured the business arrangement he had made with the ship's captain. He was left behind. That was not the first time John Washington had been dealt a poor hand. He grew up during the Little Ice Age, a resurgence of the plague, the Reformation in England, mass witch hunts that saw his boyhood friends killed. Instead of the education slated for him at Oxford University, the English Civil War saw his family ousted from favor. Once in Virginia, John Washington proved to be well suited to the work of a planter and a politician. During a time of growing separation between the elite and the burgeoning lower class, John retained such popularity with all sides that he influenced events more than most prominent characters of his time. A little-known war took place in the Mid-Atlantic at the same time as the first of the French and Indian Wars in New England. John was heavily involved in that conflict and demonstrated wisdom in his diplomatic effort to create peace. John bought thousands of acres during his lifetime in Virginia and ceded the land upon which George Washington's Mount Vernon would sit. George's great-grandfather John, the first Washington family immigrant to America, first demonstrated most of the traits one later recognizes in George. Uncanny similarities are speckled throughout the book and cause one to wonder if there may not be some factual basis to the vaunted Washington Providence. John Washington's influence and that of his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren would impact the entirety of the British colonies in North America before George was even born. John's story is one of overcoming adversity in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The mortality rate in colonial Virginia when he settled was near 50%. He lost parents, mentors, friends, 2 wives and children, was married 3 times, and by his death at age 47, no less than 9 to 12 children from 8 different families were living in and around his homes. Shipwrecked is an amazing story about the first Washington family immigrant to America, his life, family, friends, and events that eventually helped shape a country. Amazingly, this story has yet to be told. Once you start reading Shipwrecked, don't be surprised if you have trouble putting it down. Chapter 1 is available in its entirety on audiobook on John Washington's YouTube page. And now, an excerpt from Chapter 2. By 1655 and 56, London was a large, bustling city and international melting pot of culture. It would later be said near the ports that, quote, a man would be apt to find himself in another country, end quote, given the variety of people. It was noted that among the resident population, somewhat of the same language is spoken, but people came from all over the world to do business there. The businessman named Alexander Hay had obtained the waterfront property in London just a few years earlier. Over time, he would transform it into the famous Hayes Wharf, contributing to the east-west divide that separated various types of incoming trade goods to one side or the other of London Bridge. The Thames River, where Hayes Wharf was located, became a hub of commercial activity. In the age prior to industrial infrastructure, a ship's size made all the difference in whether they would offload on the east or west side of the bridge. From there, experienced merchants dictated the flow of goods in and around the city, using knowledge gained through years of selling and trading. In time, Bristol, which sat on the opposite west-facing coast of England, would come to rival London in her notoriety for merchant activity. The two cities collectively would eventually help England rival the Dutch-controlled trade routes. When John Washington appeared on the London scene as a young man, he had completed his apprenticeship and come of age as an experienced sailor and merchant. No known likeness of John Washington exists. One is left to the imagination as to what he looked like. In existing portraits of John's mother and father, Amphilis and Reverend Lawrence Washington, and John's firstborn son, Lawrence, one sees a hint of the features that later strike observers about the appearance of Augustine and his son George Washington. For example, it seems the foreheads of Washington men share the high hairline and particularly prominent forehead. As a sailor, John Washington probably had the skin of a man often in the sun and tanned and dark. He may have worn loose-fitting clothing from the limited diet and physical work of a sailor. Much as the imagination frames what John looked like, one can only imagine what John and the other sailors wore in their professions. During the age prior to uniforms to denote rank among royal sailors and separate textiles to identify a merchant from any other trade, every man dressed as seemed good to his eyes. John probably wore a linen shirt, waistcoat, breeches and stockings, black leather shoes and buckles, and a plain black leather hat with no fancy cockade. No article of clothing would have differentiated the sailors from the merchants, captains, except maybe the senior man on the ship having nicer clothes than the others. Sailors could purchase clothes along their ocean journey from an onboard salesman who guarded a special box of necessities. The salesman, who may have just been a sailor given the designation at the random on a per-trip basis, was called the sloop seller. He held a box of clothes and shoes for purchase by sailors either outright or using credit against their future payments. John Washington arrived in London in February, the notorious low point of the trading season just prior to the blooming of spring. At the time, a calendar year went from April 1st through March 25th. This would change over the next century as global trade routes expanded and countries adopted more uniform standards. To listen to the rest of Chapter 2 and additional chapters, please consider supporting this work on Patreon for only $1 a month. Patreon.com/shipwreckedbook. Thank you. To purchase the entire book outright, please visit Amazon.com/author/nicholasdgarrett or visit George Washington's Birthplace National Park, 1732 Popes Creek Road, Washington's Birthplace, Virginia.